So now we know what an argument is, and we have distinguished an argument from a non-argument. So now we are going to talk about how to evaluate an argument finally, or at least begin to. So basically, if you're evaluating an argument, you want to know two things. Do the premises support the conclusion, or are all the premises true? That's the simple way to put it. But then we have to distinguish here between how to evaluate a deductive argument and an inductive argument, because they're going to be evaluated in different ways. So let's start with a deductive argument. There are two ways that a deductive argument can be a good argument, and one is validity and the other one is soundness. It's important to distinguish these two things. We're going to talk about validity first because validity is part of soundness. So we have to talk about validity first. So validity has to do with the form of the argument. And for a valid deductive argument, that's an argument where it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. So if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And as you can see by that definition, we're not concerned yet with whether the premises are true. Remember that the word if is super important in logic. If you have the word if, that means you're not making a claim as to whether whatever follows the if is true or not yet. So we don't know yet if the premises are true, but we do know that if they were true, the conclusion would also have to be true. Another way you can put this is the conclusion follows with strict necessity from the premises. So, in an invalid deductive argument, then, it is possible for the conclusion to be false given that the premises are true. There's no wiggle room here at all. So if the premises are true, it's possible for the conclusion to be false, then it's invalid. So the conclusion then does not follow with strict necessity from the premises, even though it claims to, because if it didn't claim to, it wouldn't be a deductive argument, right? We saw that before. So how do we know? How do we test? Well, we can ask ourselves whether it's possible, if the premises are true, that the conclusion could be false. Because if it's possible, then it's not a valid argument. So here's an example. All television networks are media companies. NBC is a television network, therefore NBC is a media company. We know that this conclusion is true. The problem I think that people have sometimes is when they're looking at an argument, they'll immediately look at the conclusion and decide whether they agree with it. But that's not the way to figure out whether some argument is a good argument. Okay? You can agree with the conclusion. The conclusion can even be true, and the argument can be terrible. So what you need to do is ignore the conclusion at first, look at the premises, and ask yourself whether the conclusion follows from them. So it's important to do it this way, and not simply simply say, well, I agree with that conclusion. So we know the conclusion is true because we know that NBC is a media company. But is it the case that the premises, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true? Well, let's look. So all television networks are media companies. Okay, if that's true, and if NBC is a television network, then NBC is a media company, right? Yeah. Because it's saying that every single television network is a media company. So if NBC is a television network, it must be a media company. So that would be a valid argument. All banks are financial institutions. Wells Fargo is a financial institution. Therefore, Wells Fargo is a bank. Again, you're going to look at this maybe, and you're going to say, oh yeah, sure, Wells Fargo is a bank. I know that. My credit card's through Wells Fargo, whatever. But wait a minute, look more carefully. It says all banks are financial institutions, okay? Wells Fargo is a financial institution. Those two things are true, let's say, for right now, but the conclusion doesn't follow from those two premises. Because the fact that all banks are financial institutions, even if that's true, doesn't mean that all financial institutions are banks. Okay? It doesn't go the opposite way. We have to be very careful with this kind of thing. So even if we know that all banks are financial institutions, we don't know that all financial institutions are banks. I'd like to use the example of Mike the Tiger just because it's easy. So let's say this, all tigers are orange. Okay? And then if we were to say, Mike is orange, therefore Mike is a tiger, that doesn't follow, right? Because not all orange things are tigers. So even though all tigers are orange, even if that were true, which of course it isn't, not all orange things are tigers, we know that. So we cannot conclude just because Mike is orange that Mike is a tiger. So again, you have to look at these arguments pretty carefully in order to know, to not just say, well, I know the conclusion is true, therefore I know this is a good argument. Here's a weird one. All automakers are pharmaceutical companies. United Airlines is an automaker, therefore United Airlines is a pharmaceutical company. Again, you're going to look at the conclusion perhaps here and say, well, no, that's false, right? United Airlines is not a pharmaceutical company. But wait. The first premise says all automakers are pharmaceutical companies. Let's suppose that that were true. And we have to do that, right, to evaluate an argument. We have to suppose that the premises are true. So suppose that all automakers were pharmaceutical companies. And suppose that United Airlines were an automaker. Would the conclusion follow? It would, right? Because if it were the case that that were true, then the conclusion would be true. Again, it doesn't matter whether the premises are true right now. If the premises were true, would the conclusion follow? If the answer to that is yes, then it's a valid argument, whether or not we agree with the conclusion. Again, you could take the same thing and you could say, all tigers are orange. Mike is a tiger, therefore Mike is orange. Again, it's a valid argument, even though all tigers aren't orange. Okay? So we're just looking at the form at this point. So remember, valid arguments can have false premises. Valid arguments can even have false conclusions. But any deductive argument that has a true premises and a false conclusion is invalid. So it cannot be the case that if the premises were true, the conclusion could be false and have it be valid. So just knowing the truth or falsity of the premises and the conclusion doesn't tell us whether it's valid or not, unless we have true premises and a false conclusion. So that's what we're looking for to determine whether an argument is valid or not. So here are a couple kind of odd examples to look at. So the first one, we know the conclusion is false, right? We know that Shakespeare didn't write a science fiction novel. But again, that doesn't really matter right now because we're trying to just determine validity. So let's think about these premises. Could these premises be true and the conclusion false? Because that would make it invalid, right? If it were true that Moby Dick was written by Shakespeare, and if Moby Dick were a science fiction novel, then Shakespeare would have written a science fiction novel, right? It's impossible for those premises to be true and the conclusion false. So that one's actually valid. Second one, this one I think he would call an arithmetic argument or whatever he called it, where it's based on mathematics, deductive argument. You just have to figure out north and south here, which is kind of mathematical. So if London is north of Paris and south of Edinburgh, then is Paris south of Edinburgh? I mean, if you kind of were to draw a little map, you would see that that's obviously true. And if London were north of Paris and south of Edinburgh, I honestly don't know if it is. I would have to look at a map. It doesn't matter, right, though? Because if that were true and you draw a little chart and you can show that, then Paris has to be south of Edinburgh. So I think that's false. I think that's what the point of this one is, but it doesn't matter because if those premises were true, again, the conclusion would have to be true. Last one is kind of odd too. So if George Washington were beheaded, then George Washington died. George Washington died, therefore George Washington was beheaded. This is a really common fallacy, and it's made more obvious here by the fact that we know that George Washington wasn't beheaded, but again, we don't want to look at the conclusion first. So is it possible for these premises to be true and the conclusion false? Well, premise one, if George Washington was beheaded, then George Washington died. Let's suppose that is true, and that really is true, right? If it were the case that he was beheaded, then he would have died. You can't be beheaded and stay alive. So the second premise is George Washington died. Could those two be the case and both be true and the conclusion be false? Yes, right? Because again, premise one isn't asserting that George Washington was beheaded. It's simply saying if he was beheaded, then he would have died, right? And so that could be true. And the second one could be true. And in fact, they are both true, right? George Washington is dead. And if he were beheaded, he would have died. So those two are actually true, even though he wasn't beheaded. You see the difference here? And it doesn't matter whether he was beheaded or not, but if he had been, he would have died. That's the way that human biology works. So it could be the case that those two premises were true and the conclusion is false. And in fact, that is the case in real life. So we know that that's not a good argument. So the first two, weird as they are valid. The third one, weird as it is invalid. So then let's talk about soundness. So a sound argument has to be valid first. So again, only deductive arguments can have soundness and validity. If you have a deductive argument, you determine whether it's valid first, because validity is part of soundness. It cannot be sound without being valid. It must be valid if it's sound. So both conditions must be met for an argument to be sound. If either is missing, the argument is unsound. So it must be valid and have all two premises. So in an unsound deductive argument, either it is invalid, in other words, the conclusion does not follow from the premises, or the premises can be true and the conclusion false, or it has one or more false premises. It only has to have one false premise, right? But that false premise must be needed to support the conclusion, so it has to be part of the argument. It can't be one of those statements that we talked about before that doesn't really have anything to do with the conclusion. So it has to be an integral part of the argument. So again, this brings him into the topic of unneeded premises. So if you have premises that are superfluous and don't really have anything to do with the argument, it doesn't really matter whether they are whether they're true or not. And so analogous remarks extend to induction. He says, we'll talk about that later. But if the premises are part of the argument and one of them is false, then the argument is unsound. Okay, so we're seeing the same arguments here again. Are these arguments sound or unsound? And we saw that the first two were valid, right? So to determine whether they're sound, what we need to do is find out whether the premises are true. And this is just going to involve some research, right? The first one you probably know the answer to without looking anything up, because you know that Moby Dick was not written by Shakespeare. It was written by Herman Melville, right? So we know that that first premise is definitely false. We don't even need to go any further at that point, because that premise is integral to the argument. It's important. It's part of the evidence for the conclusion, and it's false. So we don't even need to look any further. The second one, I think, is also one of those premises is false, but my geography is terrible, so I'll leave you to that one to you to look it up. You just need to find one premise that's false. Again, don't look at the conclusion to see if that's false right away. We look at the premises first to see if they're false. The third one, we said that one was invalid. So is it sound? No, right? Because it cannot be invalid and also be sound. So again, we don't even need, let's suppose we didn't know if George Washington was beheaded. It doesn't matter. Because for one thing, that's not being claimed, though the premise that we would need to investigate would be whether George Washington died or whether people can live if they're beheaded, right? But it doesn't even matter. We don't even need to do that because we know this argument is invalid, and if it's invalid, it cannot be sound. So evaluating inductive arguments is even more tricky than evaluating deductive arguments. A strong inductive argument. So remember, inductive arguments don't have soundness and validity. They have something called strongness, and then they have something called cogency. So strongness is kind of like validity, but it's not going to work the same way because it's not deductive. So, and remember what that means is that the conclusion doesn't have to necessarily follow from the premises for an inductive argument. It could be the case you could have a good inductive argument where the premises were true and the conclusion false. But it has to do with probability. So how likely is it that the premises are true and the conclusion false? If it's very likely, then it's not a very good argument. So a strong inductive argument is one where it's improbable that the conclusion is false given that the premises are true. So again, it's about probability. It's not going to be necessity here. If it's strong, then the conclusion follows probably from the premises. And in the same way, a weak inductive argument is one where the conclusion does not follow probably from the premises, even though it claims to. So this is mushy. This is not very, there's going to be some disagreement on whether inductive arguments are weak or strong because it's kind of a probabilistic sort of thing. Okay, so there's some ways that you can evaluate an inductive argument for weakness or strongness, and one is uniformity of nature. So we can use this principle when we're looking at an argument. We can say, okay, well, the future tends to replicate the past. Regularities that prevail in one spatial reason prevails in another spatial reason. So this is one way that we can try to say, well, okay, this is a pretty decent argument. It's likely that the conclusion is going to follow. Why? Okay, so every time I've tasted sugar, it's always tasted sweet. So the uniformity of nature is going to say that sugar will always taste sweet. So good inductive arguments accord with the uniformity of nature. They have conclusions we expect to turn out to be true. And so if the conclusion of this kind of argument turns out to be false, then we would be surprised. Again, this is very mushy, right? And in fact, my colleague uses the example, I forget what the argument is, but it's some kind of inductive argument to the fact that it would snow in Louisiana, right? And that's very unlikely, but it did happen. So this is something that you could make a good inductive argument, and it, in the conclusion, could still be false. Like, it could still happen, right? So how do we test for strength with inductive arguments? We assume the premises are true, and then we determine whether the conclusion is probably going to be true. And we're going to link up the premises, he says, with regularities that exist in our experiential background. In other words, we're going to look at what we've experienced in life and say, well, does this make sense? Is this likely? So if it's a causal inference, we line up the information with premises with no causal patterns. So if I like take a match and I rub it against the box, right, it's probably going to light. And that's a causal inference. You know, rubbing the match on the box causes it to light. And so that we could make an argument to the conclusion that it's likely to light. But, you know, there might be some instances where it might not. You can see how this is more of an empirical sort of test than the deductive arguments. So here's an example. All dinosaur bones discovered to this day have been at least 50 million years old, so probably the next dinosaur bone will be at least 50 million years old. Pretty good argument, right? It's making a claim from the fact that everything we've observed so far has been this way, therefore the next thing probably will be too. This is a weird one because apparently, and I don't know anything about this kind of thing, but apparently the premise is false. But again, we're not talking about whether the premises are true yet. What we're saying is whether it seems to follow. And I think with induction, this is really hard. Like, it's really hard to separate these two things, strength and cogency, because if we're basing our evaluation of the argument on our experience, it seems like we're already talking about whether the premises are true or not, and we're not supposed to be. So with induction, it's very difficult. But in any case, meteorites if meteorites contain salt, then the next one will contain salt. Yeah, it's probably a strong argument. So here's another one. During the past 50 years, inflation has consistently reduced the value of the American dollar. Therefore, industrial productivity will probably increase in the years ahead. Is this one strong or weak? Weak, right? Because the conclusion really doesn't have anything to do with the premise. So here you can see how even if the premise were true, the conclusion doesn't really have anything to do with it. So it's not, the probability seems very weak here. This one I thought was tough because it kind of depends on what you know, again, about French wine, which I know nothing about. So it says Dom Perignon champagne, which is made in France, sells for over $100 a bottle. Marquis de Cour is also French champagne, therefore it probably too sells for over $100 per bottle. He says this one's weak, but I don't see it, because to me it seems like it could be true, or it could be a good argument, because again, it all depends on what you know about French champagne. But he says it's weak. Okay, so here's kind of a summary of this part here. If the conclusion, differences in evaluating inductive and deductive arguments. So if the conclusion of a deductive argument is necessarily true independent of the premises, the argument is still valid. But the conclusion of an inductive argument is probably true independent of the premises, the argument is weak. Okay, this seems weird, right? Because I wish he didn't bring some of this stuff in because it's confusing. This one, what this is trying to say is that if you have a deductive argument that ends with a premise that's necessarily true no matter what is going on in the world, say you have a deductive argument where the conclusion is, I hate this example, but let's try it. A bachelor is an unmarried man. Then no matter what the premises are true, no matter what premises you put in front of that, the argument is still considered valid. This is a very strange, and again, I wish he hadn't brought this in because I think it just confuses the issue, but it is true that if you have a necessarily true conclusion, in other words, a true conclusion that cannot be false, no matter what the circumstances. And the philosophers argue about what these things are. Let's just say something like 1 + 1 = 2 for now. The bachelor example may or may not work. You know, some people say that's also necessarily true, but say your conclusion is 1 + 1 = 2. The premises could be anything. The premise could be God exists, therefore 1 + 1 = 2. The premise could be there are flying unicorns, therefore 1 + 1. It doesn't matter. And this is very weird, but it's hopefully something you won't see a lot because there's no point in making that kind of argument, which is exactly why it counts as valid. But that's what he's trying to say here, and you're not going to see this in the homework, so you don't have to worry about it too much. It's just, like I said, a little strange anomaly. Okay, but I guess the point he's trying to make is the second one. If the conclusion of an inductive argument is probably true independent of the premises, the argument is weak. So even if you have a pretty decent conclusion, like George Washington is dead, and then your premises don't really lead to that, that's a bad argument. So the point he's trying to make is that there are cases, rare cases, where you can know that a deductive argument is valid, even if the premises don't really support it. But there are no cases like that with an inductive argument. I think that's the point he's trying to make here. Again, we can kind of ignore this for the most part. Okay. An inductive argument that has true premises and a probably false conclusion is weak. So a weak inductive argument is one that has true premises and a possibly false conclusion, in a similar way to where a deductive argument cannot. Invalid deductive argument is one where the premises can be true and the conclusion false. But again, remember, with induction, it's only weakness, and it's only very sort of subjective-ish whether it's a good argument or not, because it's probability. Okay, so this is a little bit important later on. So, total evidence requirement. The premises must not exclude. This is talking about inductive arguments again, okay? We're talking about the strength of inductive arguments. So, if the premises of the argument exclude or overlook crucial pieces of evidence that undermine the stated premises and require a different conclusion, then the argument is weak. So you can have, for an inductive argument, you can have some true premises, and they can lead to a probable conclusion, and you might want to say that it's strong. But if it leaves out a crucial piece of information, then it is not strong. So again, this is really difficult, I think, with inductive arguments. To figure out their strength is much more complicated than deductive. So as you probably could guess, there are degrees of strength with an inductive argument, unlike validity and invalidity of deductive arguments. Look, a deductive argument is either valid or invalid, but you can have degrees of strength and weakness in inductive arguments. So to be considered strong, an inductive argument must have a conclusion that is more probable than improbable. And he says this is 50%. Again, this is not something that's very precise. Because you can ask, with certain things, maybe you could measure whether it was 50% likely or not. But with other things, you really can't. Like with the weather, for example, if you look at your phone and it says 50% likely rain, that's not a very precise thing, right? Somebody else might make a similar prediction that would say it was 49%. So some of these probabilities are not very precise, and that's part of the problem with trying to evaluate inductive arguments. Okay, here's some examples. Do we think these are sound or weak? And you might not agree with me on these, and that's okay. So, the grave marker at Arlington National Cemetery says that John F. Kennedy is buried there. It must be the case that Kennedy really is buried in the cemetery. To me, that argument is strong. If there's a grave marker at Arlington Cemetery, I'm guessing that it's probably correct. Now, there's tons of conspiracy theories around John F. Kennedy's assassination, so I imagine there are quite a few conspiracy theorists who would say that that's a bad argument. And we could argue back and forth about the probability of it. How about this one? The ebb and flow of the tides has been occurring every day for millions of years, but nothing lasts forever. Therefore, probably the motion of the tides will die out within a few years. Is that one sound or weak? That one seems to me to be pretty weak for this reason. Even if the premises were true, I don't think the conclusion follows, because the claim that nothing lasts forever doesn't specify a timeline, and the conclusion does. So the conclusion says it'll die out within a few years. So a few years, we have to make an assumption about what that means, right? So all this is very loose, but unless you mean a few million years or a few billion years, by a few years, which seems unlikely to me, then this one seems probably false, or probably weak, right? Because yes, eventually the motion of the tides will die out, and that will probably be because the Earth is destroyed, but that's not going to happen in a few years, most likely. It's most likely going to happen in a few billion years. So I think the second one's pretty weak. The last one, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself. There are people have no reason to fear serial killers." What do you think? It seems weak to me, because I don't think that that's what he meant. When he said that, he was talking about impending war. He wasn't talking about serial killers. So to me, that's a reason to think that one's weak. But see how this is not very precise? We could argue about this. Okay, so little recap. Weakness and strength, of inductive arguments is a bit like validity and invalidity for deductive arguments. Then for deductive arguments, we also have soundness, right, which is validity plus true premises. So we have a similar thing for inductive arguments, where we had strength and weakness, and now we're going to have cogency. So a cogent inductive argument is strong and has all true premises. So this is where we're finally going to get to talk about whether the premises are true or false in our inductive arguments. But again, it's just really tricky because we're kind of already talking about that. Anyway, remember too that they also must meet the total evidence requirement, so they can't leave out some important crucial piece of information. But if either of these conditions is missing, the argument is not cogent or uncogent. So again, the conclusions of cogent arguments are probably true because we have true premises, we have a strong argument, so we have pretty good probability that the conclusion is true. An uncogent argument is an inductive argument that is weak, has one or more false premises, fails to meet the total evidence requirement, or any combination of these. So you can have any of these three problems with your argument and it doesn't count as cogent. Here I gave you the exact same examples that I put in the earlier on, so that wasn't very smart. But anyway, you can look at them again and determine, well, I guess it makes sense. I mean, we didn't talk about their cogency. Right. Okay, so we didn't talk about their cogency yet. We just talked about their weakness or strength, didn't we? So let's talk about their cogency or uncogency. Okay, so the first one we said that it was strong. I thought it was strong. Is it cogent? What do we need to add to strength to get cogency? Well, we need to know whether the premises are true, right? And whether they would leave out some evidence. So let's talk about that. So the grave marker at Arlington National Cemetery says that John F. Kennedy is buried there. I have no idea if that's true. I imagine it probably is, but you would have to look it up. If that premise is true, then I think it's probably a cogent argument because I already said that I thought it was strong. What about the second one? The ebb and flow of the tides has been occurring every day for millions of years. True. Nothing lasts forever. Also true. Does the conclusion, though, follow? I said I thought this one was weak. So even if we agree with the premises, if we say that it's weak, then it's not cogent, right? Because it has to be that the premises are true and also that it's strong. All right, what about the last one? Did Franklin Delano Roosevelt say we have nothing to fear but fear itself? I think so. Wait. No. That was John F. Kennedy who said that, right? Look it up. It's up to you. You find it out. I think that was actually John F. Kennedy who said that. So then if that were true, then we have a false premise, right? And if we have a false premise, then it's uncogent because it can't be cogent and have false premises. So there you go. There's your answer right there. And you might not agree, and that's okay, because again, the inductive arguments is kind of not, it's not an exact science. So remember, with deductive arguments, validity is precise, and it's either valid or invalid based on the form of the argument. The soundness, you can argue about that because we're adding the validity. To the validity, we're also adding whether premises are true or false, which is something we can argue about. With inductive arguments, you have strength or weakness, which we can argue about. You also have cogency, which is strength or weakness plus true premises, which we can also argue about. So inductive arguments are subject to more debate than deductive arguments. So that's your overview of cogency, strength, validity, and soundness.